Hey everyone, I'm Chris. I serve as the lead pastor of Mill Creek Foursquare, and welcome to our podcast. This exists as an extension of the teaching ministry of our pastoral team. Here you're going to be able to find everything from Sunday messages to midweek communications, classes, interviews, conversations with friends. So we hope that you feel invited to participate in the life of our fellowship and receive of this ministry. Here you're going to be able to learn more about current events and much about the scriptures. So enjoy, relax, breathe, and ultimately may you be experiencing the presence of God. Our goal is to make disciples of Jesus who are experiencing his life, engaging in his presence, extending the gospel to their family, neighborhood, workplace, and world. So welcome and enjoy.
Welcome to episode number 3 in our Mill Creek Foursquare podcast. This is John Bental, and I'm here with Trevor Horn. He's one of the pastors here on staff. He's part of the teaching team, and he and I are going to continue some of the conversations that Pastor Chris and I started in the first few episodes of the podcast. We continue to discuss the book of Revelation, which is the focus both of our sermon series and also these conversations on the podcast. Our goal in this episode is to explore in more detail the language of apocalyptic and how it is used within the book of Revelation, within the wider New Testament, and also how it becomes and can be understood as a significant genre category that helps us to understand what this book is about, what this book is trying to do or accomplish, and also how it goes about doing those things. So in our last episode, Pastor Chris and I explored the genre or the genres of the book.
It was well done.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Yeah, and it was helpful. We tried to unpack as much as we could the 3 major genre categories that we would suggest and many scholars would suggest are the most helpful categories or classifications for making sense of this book, reading it wisely, reading it responsibly in accordance with its own context and frame of reference. We talked about it being a letter, being a prophetic text, and then also being an apocalyptic text. And what Trevor and I are going to do in this episode is go into a little bit more detail with that third category, especially because out of those 3 genre categories, like Chris and I talked about, many of us kind of know what to do with a letter for the most part. There are interpretive challenges, but we can sort of make some sense of the letters in the New Testament. A genre like prophecy or prophetic literature might have a few more interpretive challenges for us, but still, many of us are somewhat familiar with these kinds of texts and can make some sense of them. When we come to apocalyptic, as much as, Chris and I spent a bit of time talking about it, both Trevor and Chris have helpfully provided frameworks for us in the context of sermons, and yet it still is relatively unfamiliar for us. Yeah. We rarely read other texts like this in any way.
You're telling me you don't read apocalyptic literature all the time, right? Reading your kids getting to bed or something?
Every once in a while.
Dragon with 7 heads or something?
Probably not the best bedtime literature. Maybe early morning devotions is better for kids. Yeah. But yeah, so part of the purpose of today's or this week's episode is to go into a little bit more detail with regard to what exactly is this apocalyptic literature all about. And the way that we're going to try to do that is first, we're going to talk a little bit about the language itself. Where does this title or genre classification get its name from, and what's the meaning and significance of this Greek terminology? And then eventually we'll also spend some time talking about how it comes to be understood as a specific genre that can help us understand ancient literature. But before we get into all of that, Trevor, would you mind describing for us, before we have any discussion about what Greek terminology means or what scholars say this or that genre is and for what reason, it's helpful to recognize or acknowledge that we all come to the biblical text with all sorts of assumptions and presuppositions, often shaped by our culture and experience. So when people think about the terminology or the concept of an apocalypse in our culture, what do you think are some of the primary cultural associations people have?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost an entire genre, I would say, in the sense of our modern culture, right? We're not, in no way right now am I talking about our defining the apocalyptic literature of the scriptures, but from a cultural sense, from like a 21st century Westerner American, it's almost like there is this own genre in movies and TV shows that pervades our cultural moment and almost defines apocalypse in a certain way. So I think of, gosh, I was making a list, right? I was sitting with my wife, I was talking to Hillary last night, and we were just listing off movies that came to our mind. And so some were like 2012, for example, the movie 2012, and it was, have you seen 2012?
I don't think I have.
Okay, it's basically they're predicting that the Mayans predicted that 2012, they had that cipher secret predictive code that 2012 was the end of the world, and it's basically a movie about how humans it was a climate change, whatever else, brought upon basically the end of the world, some sort of apocalypse. So I mean, there's this one scene where like the plane is there. There's a huge mushroom cloud chasing them, basically storm cloud, and the plane barely gets off, and then the entire landing strip just falls under the earth or something. 2012, you think of, Hunger Games, for example. There's this whole genre of apocalyptic end of the world type stuff that is all about teenagers. Maze Runner, Hunger Games is another one.
And turn to the youth when the world starts to end. Good.
I think of WALL-E. I know this is a silly example, but WALL-E in some ways is humans have left the earth because they destroyed the planet or something, and now WALL-E's this little trash robot as they're trying to see if they can actually rebuild the earth. I would say all of these genres pervade our cultural moment in sense of an apocalypse. I would say all of them are saying the same thing, though, that all of them refer to an apocalypse as the cosmic unraveling of everything good. I don't know any modern movie that would actually be a positive, right? In some ways, it's humans, because of our own rebellion or struggles, have unleashed some sort of apocalypse, whether it's a global warming or something like that. Sometimes it's a external force like a god or something like that, or aliens or whatever else is bringing upon the end of the world. And sometimes it can be a myriad of things, but the whole point is that all of it is not a positive thing. It's a negative thing about this unraveling of good things. And so it carries with it very negative connotations, and I would say a lot of fear in the sense that it brings up. And I think it resonates with us in our cultural moment because there's maybe this deep sense that pervades us that we feel like we're in touch with something's almost going to go wrong, right? We're almost waiting for the other shoe to drop, and we do that in our individual lives, but I think at a corporate level, we almost do this too, where it's this sense that the whole thing is just, this whole ship is going down. And so I would say in many ways that is the cultural understanding of an apocalypse. Yet I know we're going to talk about this more today, is that, in no way is the cultural definition of the cosmic unraveling of everything good, in no way is that have bearing on the scriptural definition. And I think what happens a lot of times is that we step into a book like Revelation or any other apocalyptic literature, and we almost transport these cultural understandings into the scriptures itself to understand the imagery. So when we see something like ecological disaster in the book of Revelation, we transport this movie 2012 when we start to think, okay, this is the unraveling of everything versus understanding its context or background.
Yeah, definitely. There's a tendency that's basically inevitable that we have when reading the Bible to come to it with our own cultural frames of reference, with a whole set of experiences and assumptions. And if we're not careful, we tend to read those uncritically into the text. And one of the ways that is helpful to sort of counteract that tendency is if we can learn a little bit about the context in which a text was produced, the way certain language was used, the kinds of frames of reference that the people writing and hearing and perhaps reading these texts would have just sort of taken for granted, that we might need to do a little bit of work or a little bit of digging to try to understand from our modern or contemporary perspective. So if what you've just described, some of the kinds of things that show up in our films and in that kind of thing in our context, if this isn't necessarily the most helpful set of images or ideas or assumptions for understanding what an apocalypse is in the Bible, if it's not primarily about, if an apocalypse in the Bible is not primarily about sort of the cosmic unraveling of everything that is good, then how would we define what an apocalypse is according to the Bible?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think we just need to open the scriptures. I remember I had a theology professor who he said, never do theology with your Bible closed.
I like it.
And I think especially with apocalyptic literature, that's the reality, right? Because we need the scriptures to, in every way, redefine and really interpret for us what is reality and to be able to make sense of our world. And so I just want to go to the book of Revelation. That's a great place to look as we're talking about this. But in Revelation, chapter 1, verse 1, right away we're introduced to the language of apocalypse. Right? Revelation, verse 1 of chapter 1 says the revelation of Jesus Christ. And this word revelation is the word apocalypto, or did I say that right?
Yeah, apocalypto.
Apocalypto, sorry. John, you're the scholar here.
No, so it's fine. It's actually, it would be the noun there, apocalypsis.
There it is.
But the related verb is apocalypto.
Yeah, so this word in Revelation is the word that we get apocalypse from. And it means, obviously, at its core, to uncover or to reveal something. Now, I think in many ways, when we read this word, we think it's just a word that pops up in the book of Revelation, or it begins the book of Revelation. But we don't always realize that this is actually a common Greek term. That this is actually a common term in their cultural moment. This is actually a common term throughout the New Testament. It's not really like we're hiding something. Like you can actually just look up this word in the concordance or Google. I guess I shouldn't say Google it because you always got to be careful. Yeah. I had a professor in college who said, Google can be a good place to start, but you should never end your research at Google.
Yeah, I like that.
But so it's a common word. So for example, in Matthew 11, we see the language of apocalypse as well in the Gospels. And we see this in Matthew 11. Jesus is speaking, and we're told this, Matthew 11, verse 25. At that time, Jesus declared, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and understanding and revealed them, apocalypse them to little children. And so it's funny, Jesus is saying that Father, you apocalypse things. God apocalypse things to children, right? He reveals things. So clearly this revelation, this revealing is not pertaining to the cosmic unraveling of everything good or something, but it's about getting a new set of eyes, right? Seeing something in a certain way. Or for example, in verse 27, we see this language again where Jesus says, all things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father. And no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him, to apocalypse him. And so it's this picture of whom Jesus, the Son, chooses to reveal, to apocalypse, to give a revelation, a new and fresh understanding of who God is, who Jesus is. And so in many ways, it's a word about giving us a new set of eyes, giving us a new way to look at the world, right? Like recently I got a new pair of glasses and my eyes have been hurting, but now I feel like about a week in, my eyes have been setting into this new set of glasses. They're definitely stronger. Late 20s is hitting me hard. But it feels like I can see the world in a different way. And I feel like that's the picture of what an apocalypse, this word we're tracing through the New Testament. The most clearest use of this is in the book of Galatians. It's actually language the Apostle Paul uses. And in the book of Galatians, we're told this. Galatians 1, Paul uses this language again. He says, for I did not receive it, he's speaking of the gospel, from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation, an apocalypse of Jesus Christ. And a little further down, he says this in verse 15, but when he who had set me apart before I was born and who called me by his grace was pleased to reveal, to apocalypse his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. And so Paul is alluding to, he's speaking to, he's referring to here his own apocalypse, his own revelation. And he's referring to that story back in the book of Acts, when we know on Damascus Road that Paul, or Saul at the time, who was persecuting followers of the way or followers of Jesus. And what took him to change his life from being this persecutor of followers of Jesus to the apostle who, behind the person of Jesus himself, is probably the most, the most important person to advance the gospel and write half of, basically the New Testament, whatever else many of the epistles we love and understand, is he needed an apocalypse. He needed a moment where his eyes were open. He needed a moment where he needed a new perspective, right? Where Jesus literally spoke to him and he had this come to Jesus moment, as I would say it. And again, this wasn't the cosmic unraveling of everything good. Though, I mean, I would say in apocalypse, when humans have a revelation of Jesus, there is some pain involved.
Sure.
I mean, when you think of it, I've been viewing the world one way, and then Jesus gives me this revealing of who he is, or this revealing of who God is, and I look at the world in a completely different way at the end of this. That can be a painful process, no question, but it's a necessary process. It's a process that I think in our language is something that all of us go through. You know, an apocalypse in many ways, by the New Testament's understanding of it, and how Paul's using it, how Jesus uses it, and how John is receiving this in the book of Revelation as well, is really this picture of being given a new perspective. It's really, in some ways, it's not just an ending, but it's a new beginning, right? That it's not just the ending of something. Like Paul's life didn't just end when he had this apocalypse of Jesus, but it began a new journey for him. It became a fresh set of eyes and really a new beginning to a new way of understanding his life and ultimately understanding love, understanding really what his whole life was about. And so I would say in many ways, the question when we think of an apocalypse is not how do I predict the end of the world or find this cipher, secret predictive code that we've been referring to, but it's a question of, am I ready for an apocalypse? Am I ready to really receive and to have something revealed to me, to have, whether that's with, you know, in following Jesus, like many of us, I know for myself, I had a moment where I came to Jesus. I had a come to Jesus moment where my life was going one way and God set me on a different path or a different direction. But I think it can apply much broader than as well. Now, so that would be, in a very short sense, the scriptural usage, the very kind of narrow of tracing the word apocalypse through the New Testament. Now, I know as we've dialogued that, you know, we looked at the cultural kind of perspective. We looked at scriptural in this narrow sense of this word apocalypse. But I also know that scholarship has seen, as we've dialogued over the last few decades, the last century or so, has had some shifts in how we understand this word as well, or how we understand apocalyptic literature in general. So I'd love to hear more. I just want to hear, how does scholarship, how's these shifting trends apply to this word as well?
Yeah, that's an important it's an important dynamic to sort of bring into conversation with what you've just been talking about, Trevor, because I think what you've given us is a really helpful insight into a relatively normal, mundane Greek word that would be used in all sorts of contexts to refer to all sorts of different kinds of things. And actually, I mean, as a sort of side note, this is the kind of thing that comes up all the time in my teaching, is I try to help students recognize, especially students who come in with a certain level of familiarity with the Bible, that some of these words that we associate it with, like spiritual things, like covenant or faith or grace or some of these, we think of these as sort of inherently spiritual or inherently theological words, when in reality they are sort of mundane words that refer to sort of normal everyday life kinds of things, but are then to put to specific use within the context of the Bible, and that's what gives them theological significance or spiritual significance. And so I think the way you briefly sort of trace the use of this term, it can help us understand this terminology in a similar way. It's not that sort of apocalypse is some sort of magical term that would only ever be used in the Bible to talk about sort of spiritual things. It's a regular word in the Greek language that would refer to uncovering something or disclosing something that was once hidden, or unveiling the true nature of things that maybe has been clouded or obscured in some way. I liked your example of getting a new pair of glasses. It actually prompted, I wasn't planning to share this story, but it prompted a memory for me. We had a family friend who I remember hearing about how he first realized in like his first years of school that he wasn't able to see as well as he assumed he was. And it was because, he was, probably a lot of people have had this experience. He was noticing that like he couldn't see the teacher's writing on the board as well as he thought he should be able to, and this kind of thing. So they go through the process of, I guess we need to get his eyes checked, need to get him glasses, this and that. But he ended up having an apocalypse. And his apocalypse was that there are individual blades of grass. Up until that point,
what do you mean he never could?
He thought grass was just this like green kind of like and with glasses, he was all of a sudden able to see like there's individual blades
What a
of grass.
revelation,
Yeah, it's an apocalypse.
So you're saying in culture, like if we were living in Jesus's day or something, we'd be walking around and we'd just be chatting, shooting the breeze. And I know where I'm saying apocalypse is like an alliteration, English, whatever else, but we'd be walking around and say, "Hey, can you apocalypse that?" Would that be kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't know enough to know exactly
language,
whether someone would sort of use it in that kind of mundane sense, but certainly it's the kind of word that doesn't just show up in our New Testament. It would be common throughout literature and culture within a sort of ancient Greco-Roman context. And the concept, and we know even the kinds of things you were talking about, God revealing things to people and people having an encounter with God that provokes a sort of dramatic reorientation of their life. Like you talked about with Paul, his apocalypse wasn't just a sort of information download so that he now knows things he didn't know before. It was also this dramatic, it's God revealing himself for the purpose of prompting this sort of dramatic life reorientation. And even when the word apocalypse isn't used, we see that kind of thing happening all over our scriptures, right? So we could, even when the word doesn't show up, we can describe people having these apocalyptic encounters, these revelatory moments where they encounter God. It contributes to a dramatic shift in perspective, but also to a more holistic, embodied kind of reorientation of life.
Yeah.
And so, all of this can be really helpful to just recognize this is a sort of a fairly normal, mundane term. It refers to these certain kinds of encounters with God that contribute to a kind of unveiling of what things truly look like, and as well as things like a kind of dramatic reorientation of life. But then there's also this other level or this other dynamic that's important to recognize, which is that, especially I think in the 19th century, biblical scholars started to recognize that there are certain kinds of literature that maybe don't fully fit our existing genre categories for biblical texts and parabiblical texts, or texts that are similar to the Bible and to the biblical documents and were produced in similar time periods. What people started to recognize was that there were these certain kinds of texts that had prophetic elements, but they also had these distinctive sort of apocalyptic elements to them. And so this kind of thing has been studied in this mode for years, for a couple centuries now. But especially in the 1970s, there was a group of scholars led by a biblical scholar named John J. Collins, who came up with a kind of definition for apocalyptic literature that really set the stage for the ensuing decades of research on these kinds of texts. And it could be helpful to actually to read the definition quickly and then maybe just unpack it a little bit, because it's a little bit dense, but it's a helpful way to kind of recognize the kinds of literary conventions, the kinds of theological themes, and the kinds of structures that these certain kinds of texts have that would cause scholars to say, oh, there's a bunch of texts that are like this, and they share a number of features in common. And the more we can understand sort of what an ancient author may have been trying to communicate by using this particular literary genre, this particular style, the better we can understand these texts and what they're ultimately trying to communicate. So Collins' famous definition is that an apocalypse in the ancient world is a genre of revelatory literature within a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, disclosing a transcendent reality which is both temporal, insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation, and also spatial, insofar as it involves another supernatural world. So there's a lot of sort of big terms in there and a number of sort of
we might need to unpack
things
that a little
going on. But the crucial thing to recognize is that an apocalypse, Collins is saying, is basically about someone having some kind of visionary or apocalyptic encounter, God revealing something to someone, and then the person is setting that revelation or that revelatory encounter within a narrative framework. So for John, for example, we see John not only saying, hey, I was hanging out on Patmos and I had this crazy vision, but then he details this sort of vision report.
Yeah.
He sets the visionary encounter that he has had in a kind of narrative framework. So it's this apocalypse, it's this divine revelation or disclosure or unveiling to a human recipient that the author then sort of interprets theologically and sets within a narrative framework.
Sets it within a story is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's kind of when we read Revelation, it feels like there's this unraveling, the story taking place. You feel like you're immersed in an ongoing narrative, especially I would say after chapter 5, right? And 6 to the end, you feel like there's a development. Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Definitely. Yeah. And actually that point is helpful to even draw out a little bit further, because one of the things that's helpful to recognize about the way the author has constructed a book like Revelation is that it's not as if he just had a wild, crazy dream and then woke up and was like, man, I got to jot down every detail before I forget it. When we look closely at the text, he's not only had a visionary encounter, but he has also processed this encounter and is interpreting it theologically and setting it in conversation with with what he knows from the Hebrew Scriptures already about the story of God and God's redemptive activities in human history. He's setting it in conversation with the specific needs and situation of these congregations in Asia that he ends up sending the letter to. So he's clearly doing something more than just, wow, that was crazy. I got to get all the details down. He's interpreting it. He's setting it within a particular theological framework, narrative framework.
Well, I think that's important for our understanding of inspiration as well, because I think that happens a lot of times in general when we read any book in the Scriptures, but we kind of have this very, I think, many narrow view of how inspiration even takes place in that way too. And I know we don't want to go all the way down this path, but I do think sometimes we have this kind of picture of, Paul got struck by lightning, his eyes roll up in his head. Luckily, he had a piece of parchment and paper in front of him, and he just started writing it or whatever else. Whereas inspiration, many times, I remember in seminary, I had one of our professors would show us a picture of, what was his name? He was Simon Schnechter, I think is what his name was, but he was when the Dead Sea Scrolls, I believe, and there's this picture of him, and there's all these scrolls everywhere. There's hundreds of scrolls in front of him, and he's arched over. I mean, you can tell he has back pain, the amount of research he's been doing, and he's writing, he's reading, and my professor said, this is a picture of inspiration in some ways, that yes, we do believe God speaks, that God worked through human styles and whatever else, but we also see that there is a place of how these writers are bringing us into almost a chorus of the Scriptures as well through their own understanding. I mean, these are brilliant writers. They're brilliant minds, theological minds as well. And so, that makes sense. Yeah.
And that's a helpful picture. I mean, we could either think about John as an author who, as it were, if he was sitting at a desk, I mean, he's probably not sitting at a desk on Patmos, but you could sort of to get a sense of what he's doing as an author, you could picture him sort of with his visionary encounter, his dramatic apocalyptic encounter sort of shaping an aspect of what he's communicating, but also with his Hebrew Scriptures out open on the desk beside him, as it were, that are also sort of shaping it. Or perhaps, I mean, that's kind of a funny picture for it and probably not a historically sort of helpful one. Yeah. Maybe a more helpful picture would be to say, this is someone who has been so immersed already in the Hebrew Scriptures as what gives shape to his understanding of who God is, who he is, what it means to be part of God's covenant people, and what God has now done in and through the person of Jesus Christ for the sake of the world, that as he tries to process his visionary encounter and as he tries to communicate it to other people in this sort of pastoral mode, he almost can't help but use the language and images that are just already part of the air that he breathes as someone who's been so shaped by the Hebrew Scriptures. But I think you're exactly right, that it's helpful to have a doctrine of inspiration that is capable of taking into account the complexities of those kinds of processes that authors would no doubt be engaged in. But I think the reason that the scholarly definition can be helpful for us is because it can help us to recognize that the reason a book like Revelation is called an apocalypse, or the reason that this is a helpful genre category for making sense of the text, is that it fits with a number of other texts that used very similar conventions or styles or had similar features and were often written for very sort of similar purposes. So they are texts that communicate some kind of revelatory encounter mediated to a human recipient, so like John, but often through the mediation of not just directly from God to the human, but also often with a sort of angelic mediator. So we see over and over in a book like Revelation, an angel maybe sort of interpreting some of the images for John or sort of guiding him through the kinds of things that he's experiencing. And when we look at a number of other apocalyptic texts like 1 Enoch or 2nd Baruch or 4th Ezra, we tend to see similar kinds of things. It's a divine revelation that's being recounted or a vision that's being reported that is set within a narrative framework. And within that narrative, there's often an angelic mediator that's sort of guiding the human recipient and sort of showing them things or explaining certain things to them or that kind of thing. And then the final component of Collins' definition that is really helpful for us is that it's all about, in being a revelation or an unveiling or an apocalypse, it's all about the disclosure of some transcendent reality. And this disclosure tends to be both spatial and temporal, meaning it's not just about sort of predicting the future, but it's about a temporal transcendence in the sense that it's beyond what we can see in our limited frame of reference
in our current moment,
the present.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's almost like God's pulling back the curtain. I think Chris uses Pastor Chris uses image before, but pulling back the curtain behind human history and saying, this is what's happening. Here's how the gears are shifting. Here's who's pulling whatever else, and you're kind of seeing almost that. I mean, it's a heavenly perspective on our earthly reality, right? So it's almost open, and it's a perspective on the now. Is that what you're alluding to? Yeah.
Exactly. So it's spatial transcendence and temporal transcendence. So we see a glimpse of sort of past, present, and future so that we can see the way that the future breaks into the present or maybe has already broken into the present and so has all sorts of implications. So that's the sort of temporal transcendence. But there's also spatial transcendence, this notion of, like you just said, a kind of heavenly perspective on human affairs. So we don't just see things as we see them, but we catch a glimpse through an apocalypse of God's perspective on human affairs.
I feel like a lot of these elements too, we understand a lot of these elements in this definition. If you pulled apart the definition, I feel like a number of these tracks we're familiar with. So maybe like a heavenly perspective, like heaven coming to earth. I think of throne room scenes like Isaiah or something when someone's brought to a throne room. When you think of like an angelic mediator, I think of the Gospels in some ways and the birth narratives and that kind of thing. And so I almost think a lot of these, it's almost like apocalyptic combining these different strands that we'd be familiar with and almost is putting them into one narrative, right? Into one narrative context. That in many ways, if you pulled these strands of this definition apart from scholarship, you'd be able to say, oh, I actually am familiar with each of these, but now they're all kind of combined into one. And so it almost feels, I don't say freakier, but it feels kind of like more outlandish, though we would be familiar with each of these strands in their own right throughout the Bible.
And that's why when you get into sort of some of the nitty gritty of how scholars discuss some of these books, it actually becomes really complicated because the relationship between prophecy and apocalyptic and how maybe one developed out of the other, there's a lot of different sort of theories about that have been proposed. But even what parts of the Bible get defined as apocalyptic can become a little bit controversial. So almost very many scholars would agree the second half or so of Daniel and Revelation, at the very least, are apocalyptic texts.
And some of Zechariah as well.
And then people Zechariah, Ezekiel, even portions of the Gospels, portions of Isaiah, these are where people might say, that has apocalyptic components to it, but it's not, maybe it doesn't fit the genre category itself. It's a little bit like how, genre classifications are often very helpful, but they're not always precise or exact, right? Yep. I mean, think about a band like Mumford and Sons. They have a lot of banjo in their music. And so someone might hear them for the first time and be like, it's a country song. And it's like, well, no, it's kind of folky and it has a whole bunch of different influences. Yes, it has a banjo, and yes, banjo tends to be featured in a lot of country music as well. But not all, anyone who creates anything isn't necessarily going to feel as an author or an artist or a creator as if they're constrained by sort of one narrowly defined genre category. They work with the available conventions of their day. They work with particular styles that will best facilitate what they ultimately want to communicate. And so like a band like Mumford & Sons, the most helpful way to understand a book like Revelation is not to try to say, well, it has to fit this genre category in exactly this way or something like that, but rather to say, as many scholars have done over time, when we look at letter, prophecy, and apocalypse and compare it to other texts that function in these ways, these are the three most helpful ways of understanding what this text is and what it's trying to do.
Well, I think that, and you're hitting on the nuance is the challenge, right? Because I think that's why some of the cultural stuff we talked about before, and even some of the secret predictive code, kind of some approaches within the Christian tradition to kind of figure out where we are, whatever else is some sort of historical map. I think that's why that becomes attractive, because it feels like it takes away the nuance of the literature, which makes it easier for us as humans. And I resonate with that, right? Because I want almost this black and white. This is the track. This is how everything, I put it this way. I interpret it. This is the one key, right? This is the one. I don't want Mumford & Sons and this confusing banjo. I want rap music or I want rock music. We almost like those lines. And when the lines get blurred in the sense of, combining different genres, whatever else, I think that's where it does get challenging for us, right? Because we struggle to make sense of, how do I make sense of each of these tracks and how they go between each other in this almost a symphony. Now, I do believe once, like you're talking about, once we understand them, it becomes really beautiful, because you see how the chorus, it's almost like they're coming together in this, John's brilliant work and this vision from Jesus. But yeah, I see the value of it, right? And as you're talking about it and understanding it, though I do understand sometimes why it might be challenging for folks when we're talking about this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that there's, I think you're exactly right, that we tend to sort of, and Chris and I talked about this a little bit in one of the earlier episodes, that we have a tendency as people, or perhaps as a culture, to sort of come to the Bible and expect it to sort of speak on our terms, according to our frame of reference, in ways that are relatively easy to understand. And maybe sometimes it will. Maybe sometimes it'll begin a story and say, there was a guy and he was named this and he went and did this thing. And we're like, okay, I know how to read this. But very often it's going to sort of come to us in a different mode, and it's going to demand of us some ability and some, intentionality to sort of do the work of trying to understand this different language, this different mode of discourse, this slightly different way of framing things. And I think I would suggest that one of the reasons that folks in our contemporary Western, or even specifically American culture, we tend to gravitate towards sort of futuristic readings of Revelation and this kind of thing. I would suggest that sometimes that just comes from a desire that we have for certainty, and a kind of preference for, well, I'd like to sort of know what's going to happen, and I'd like to be able to sort of read the signs of the times and connect them to these things, and I'd like it to make sense in sort of my frame of reference without having to understand this ancient world or this ancient context or this ancient literature. And then I think what's really unfortunate about that is I think that what a book like Revelation, like many other apocalyptic texts, is ultimately designed to do, is the purpose of it is to facilitate and cultivate a deep trust and confidence in who God is in the midst of our particular situation, and to call people back to faithful covenant witness or faithful witness to the gospel. And so what's unfortunate is that there can be a tendency within more sort of futuristic-oriented readings of the book, not only to sort of disregard the particular historical context that the book was produced in, not only to disregard or misunderstand the genre of the book, but also to kind of prioritize our own desire for certainty and confidence on our terms, rather than enter into what the book itself is trying to do and what God might ultimately be trying to do in and through it.
So it's almost like, it's like an invitation to receive it as a gift, right? To receive it as a gift from God, from John, to be able to almost take it on its own terms and receive it in the way that the author wants us to receive it. Now, to end with this, one last question.
Yeah.
So to bring this, because I know we've been talking about scripture, we've been talking some about scholarship and culture. If we brought this down to kind of the grassroots, like the earthy, kind of mundane level that we were talking to earlier, what do you believe when we talk about the word, maybe the narrow word apocalypse or apocalyptic literature, practically, what are we being invited into? Like, what would you say is the goal that we are invited into as we read this literature again and again?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think my favorite way of understanding it is this sort of catchy phrase that I should probably know who first came up with it or where it came from, but I don't. But it's that apocalyptic literature, and often prophetic literature too, and maybe in some sense the entire Bible, but certainly apocalyptic literature and certainly a book like Revelation is intended to both afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And what this refers to is this idea that the point of the book is not just to sort of give you some kind of information you didn't have. The point of the book isn't just to sort of predict the end in a way that has no bearing on the future. The point is not just to say, oh, there's a heavenly throne room up there. Isn't that cool? the whole
What a novel idea. That's fun.
Yeah, it's like a neat painting that we look at and then just go about our lives.
Yeah.
No, the whole point is that the future has broken into the present and provokes this dramatic reorientation. The point is that catching a glimpse of this transcendent heavenly perspective should change everything about the way that we see our lives and our situations. And so for people who are potentially, if we feel like chaos reigns around us and the forces of evil seem to be sort of having their way and having their say, and the kinds of questions we're asking as the people of God is, has God abandoned us? Is God really going to bring about?
Yeah, how long, O Lord?
Exactly. When we're as a community or as individuals, when one is asking those kinds of questions, an apocalyptic text can bring comfort in the midst of affliction because it insists and discloses for us that God is on his throne. Even when it doesn't look like life is working out the way it ought to, even when it doesn't look like human history is actually ever going to come to this fulfillment in which God's kingdom is established and justice is done and shalom is reestablished and everything is set right. It insists that God is on his throne, that God is in control of human history, and that God is ultimately bringing all things to their intended fulfillment. So it comforts those who are in the midst of affliction, but then it also afflicts the comfortable because it insists as well that things aren't always as they seem. And when we have become complacent or when we have been tempted to or even sort of participated in things that compromise our witness to the gospel and our identity as God's faithful covenant people, what a book like Revelation and many other apocalyptic texts are designed to do is to sort of provoke and critique and afflict folks who are so comfortable in their situations that they are actually in the midst of compromising or abandoning what their commitment ultimately should be.
So in many ways, if I'm understanding right, an apocalypse from apocalyptic literature, and then we're also talking about the narrow use of apocalypse in the New Testament as a word. In many ways, it's something we should desire, right? It's not a scary thing. I guess it may be painful, especially if this apocalypse is correcting, if this apocalypse is, what is the word of complacency, is fighting against our own complacency or maybe complicitness within some sort of idolatry or injustice. But in many ways, it is something we should desire in the sense of that we should want and desire from God to have his perspective, to have an encounter with him, to have a revelation of him, because it speaks to the deepest need of what we need as humans, right?
Yeah, well said. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We should desire to have apocalyptic encounters, and we should desire to read and to understand books like Revelation that, like you said earlier, have been given to us as a gift. It's not something to be avoided. It's not something to just sort of help us predict exactly what's going to happen in the future so that we can sort of sit back and not really worry about it until it all happens. Rather, it's designed to shape our faithful worship of God alone, as opposed to the other idols that we might be tempted toward. And it's designed to shape our practical lives of faith and spirituality and discipleship in a whole myriad of ways that, yes, have implications for the future, but already impinge on the way that we live out our gospel witness here and now.
Yeah, that's good.
Well, thanks for listening. In this episode, Trevor and I have had a good time discussing the nature of apocalyptic literature, but also the very sort of language and concept of having an apocalypse. This episode was edited by Tim Machira. It was produced by Dave Sproul, and we had music by Sherry Machira.
Thank you for joining us, and should you want more information or to engage with us further, please go to mc4us.org for more.